In the remote Dry Creek Valley, a woman has lived in complete solitude for decades, guarding her world from the outside. But when 5 strangers arrive seeking firewood and one chooses to stay, her quiet life begins to transform in ways she never imagined. Subscribe and like to follow her journey. The morning sun climbed slowly over the jagged ridges of the Dry Creek Valley, casting long, sharp shadows across the parched, rocky ground. Mara stood on the porch of her small, weather-beaten cabin, arms crossed, her gaze sweeping over the dry creek bed that cut a lazy, winding path through the scrubland. For nearly a decade, she had lived here alone, relying on her instincts and hard-earned skills to navigate the unforgiving landscape. Each day had been a test of patience, endurance, and survival, with the wind carrying dust and the occasional scent of wild sage through the still air. She had grown used to the solitude, the quiet that followed sunrise and lingered until dusk, the emptiness that allowed her to breathe freely, yet kept her heart locked tight against hope or expectation. Her cabin was modest but sturdy, a testament to her determination and stubborn independence. Inside, tools were meticulously arranged, firewood stacked in perfect order, and a small bed covered with a rough but warm blanket waited for her nightly rest. The rifle against the porch railing was more than protection. It was an extension of herself, a silent companion in a world where threats could arrive without warning. For Mara, life had become a rhythm of measured routines, drawing water from the creek, tending a small garden patch, repairing fences, and keeping watch over the surrounding hills. She had learned to read the sky, the patterns of the wind, and the subtle changes in animal tracks that hinted at movement nearby. Yet on this morning, a change arrived that she had not anticipated. From the far ridge, the faint sound of hoofbeats grew steadily louder, stirring dust from the dry earth and carrying a vibration through the stillness of her domain. Mara's pulse quickened, a familiar mixture of caution and curiosity tightening her chest. She straightened, hand resting lightly on the rifle, eyes narrowing as 6 figures emerged from the distance. Each rider moved with a quiet purpose, horses kicking up dust as they approached the creek and then the cabin. They were men of few words, their eyes alert, hands steady on reins and the tools they carried. One in particular lingered at the rear of the group, seemingly observing the land, the creek, and the woman who had called it home alone for so many years. Mara's mind raced, calculating risk, intention, and the subtle clues in their posture and demeanor. These men were not the bandits or drifters she had feared in the past. Their movements were methodical, respectful of the land and, by extension, her domain. Yet even with their quiet approach, a tension remained, the kind that accompanies strangers, entering a world long governed by isolation and routine. She stepped down from the porch slowly, allowing her boots to crunch on the dry, brittle grass, and held her hand just above the rifle, ready but not eager. The men drew nearer, stopping at a respectful distance, and one spoke, his voice low but steady, asking if there might be work to be done, if she might have a place that required attention. Mara's lips pressed together, her heart a strange mixture of relief, skepticism, and the faintest spark of intrigue. For 10 years, no one had come seeking anything from her, yet here they were, 6 quiet men offering labor, presence, and the first hint that the long solitary winters might be interrupted. The creek whispered beneath its shallow current, and the wind stirred the dust, carrying with it a sense of change, tentative yet undeniable. For Mara, the coming hours would determine if these men were merely passing shadows or the first step toward a life where solitude might coexist with carefully measured trust. The men dismounted with careful precision, their movements deliberate yet fluid, a quiet efficiency that betrayed experience and adaptability. Mara remained on the porch, eyes narrowing as she took in every detail, the way they handled the tools, the subtle checks they gave their horses, the glances exchanged without words, communicating silently and seamlessly. For years she had relied solely on herself, and even now, as their presence encroached on her solitude, she found herself assessing every action, every tone, measuring the intrusion against her hard-won independence. The first man knelt beside a pack, retrieving hammers, nails, and a few sacks of provisions, placing them neatly near the cabin wall. Another adjusted a bridle, his fingers brushing snow-colored dust from leather straps, then looked toward Mara, offering a faint, respectful nod. The quietest among them, the one who had stayed back during their approach, lingered near the creek, studying the shifting patterns of the water over rocks, the parched earth that had cracked beneath the summer sun. Mara felt the unfamiliar stir of cautious interest. There was something deliberate in his gaze, a subtle understanding of the land that mirrored her own intimate knowledge of every stone and bend in the creek. As the afternoon wore on, she allowed herself to descend from the porch, boots crunching softly against the brittle grass, rifle abandoned in the corner but still within reach. She moved deliberately among them, offering instructions here and there, correcting a misplaced stake, suggesting a better angle to support a cabin wall. Each suggestion was met with patient compliance, their quiet acknowledgement reinforcing an unspoken code: respect for her space, for her knowledge, for her authority over the land she had defended alone for so long. The men worked steadily, setting up rudimentary fences to prevent erosion near the creek, carrying firewood from distant groves, repairing a broken section of the cabin roof. Mara's vigilance slowly softened as she observed their unwavering dedication and care, noticing the small gestures of camaraderie between them, the silent coordination that seemed almost choreographed. By mid-afternoon, a subtle transformation had occurred. The tension she had carried for years, the constant weight of solitary vigilance, began to yield, replaced with a tentative sense of relief. These men were not here to conquer or disrupt. They had arrived with purpose, offering labor and presence without demanding more than what she was willing to grant. The quietest among them eventually approached Mara, hands empty but eyes steady, and asked if he might remain nearby for a time, to offer assistance as needed. Her heart quickened at the suggestion, a mixture of skepticism and intrigue pulsing through her. For 2 decades, no one had lingered. No one had paused at her threshold, seeking connection or offering partnership. Yet now, beneath the harsh sun, and across the dust-swept creek, the possibility of companionship presented itself, subtle, respectful, and wholly unprecedented. Mara realized that the rhythm of her days, long dictated by self-reliance and solitude, might be altered not forcefully, but gradually, quietly, by the patient presence of those who had ridden into her life with work and intent. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cracked earth, the men continued their tasks, their movements almost meditative, blending seamlessly into the landscape she had governed alone for so long. And for the first time in many years, Mara allowed herself to imagine that the harsh winters, the parched summers, and the quiet isolation might coexist with the gentle presence of others, their labor, their understanding, and perhaps the beginnings of trust that could endure beyond this single afternoon. The sun began its slow descent behind the jagged ridges of Dry Creek, casting the cabin and its surrounding terrain in warm amber and long, stretching shadows. Mara leaned against the corner post of her porch, arms folded, her sharp eyes following each precise movement of the 6 men as they carried planks, measured lengths, and hammered nails into place to construct a proper gate at the edge of her property. For years she had maintained only the barest semblance of barriers, fences hastily erected, gates barely functional, simply enough to mark the boundaries she alone patrolled. Now before her, these strangers worked with deliberate care and a quiet respect, their combined strength producing a structure more permanent than anything she had ever permitted herself to rely upon. She could not help but notice the subtle interplay of their coordination, the way one held a plank steady while another measured, the rhythmic hammering that punctuated the otherwise serene landscape. each movement confident yet understated, as though mindful of the delicate trust she still reserved for them. Mara's own hands itched to join, not because she needed the help, but because she sensed the potential for shared purpose. Slowly, she allowed herself to step closer, suggesting adjustments, pointing out areas where the ground was uneven or where a nail might hold firmer. Each suggestion was accepted with attentive nods, no words wasted, no impatience shown. The quietest of the men, the one who had lingered by the creek, watched her carefully, not in expectation, but in a way that seemed to mirror her own observations, keen, deliberate, and patient. Mara's mind wandered briefly to the years she had spent alone, the winters spent cutting firewood, patching the cabin, and listening to the wind whip through the barren landscape. In those years, every sound and movement had been under her scrutiny, every approach a potential threat. Yet now, as she observed the careful efforts of these men, she realized that perhaps not all intrusions sought to disrupt. Some offered stability, strength, and a subtle companionship she had not dared to consider. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in deep reds and purples, while the men worked tirelessly, the rhythmic pounding of hammers blending with the distant rustle of the creek and the faint snorts of their horses. Mara's attention shifted as the quiet man approached her directly, hands empty but his eyes steady, conveying something unspoken, a willingness to remain, to be present without expectation or demand, an acknowledgement of the careful boundaries she had set. Her pulse quickened subtly, a mixture of hesitation and curiosity, as the idea of allowing someone into her life, even in this small way, began to feel possible. Each nail set and plank placed was more than construction. It was a quiet negotiation of trust, a subtle agreement that her isolation might bend without breaking. That connection could be woven gently into her life without sacrificing the autonomy she had fiercely defended. By the time the last plank was fitted and the gate stood sturdy and true, the dusk had settled fully over Dry Creek, casting everything in muted blues and soft shadows. Mara stepped back, hands brushing against the cool wood, and allowed herself the smallest smile of recognition that her world, once strictly solitary, had begun to accommodate another presence, a tentative yet undeniable shift toward companionship, grounded in respect, patience, and shared labor. The gate now stood as a symbol, not merely of protection, but of the subtle promise that her solitude could coexist with careful, enduring trust. Twilight settled over Dry Creek, soft purples and oranges bleeding across the jagged hills as the day's labor wound down. The 6 men gathered around a modest fire near the cabin, arranging tools and supplies with careful precision. Mara stood a few steps away, the glow of a lantern casting delicate light across her weathered features, illuminating the quiet intensity of her gaze. For 20 winters, she had learned to read every flicker of wind and shadow, every subtle shift in light and landscape, and now she applied those instincts to the strangers who had entered her domain. They moved with methodical grace, each action measured yet unhurried, conveying a quiet respect for her presence and the boundaries she had long enforced. The quiet man, still lingering near the creek, studied the water's shallow ripple, as if seeking permission from the land itself to remain, to integrate without disruption. Mara's heart felt a strange mixture of vigilance and tentative warmth. The years of solitude had built walls of independence, but she now recognized that these men, through patience, attention, and silent gestures, were gently testing the limits of her isolation. One of the riders approached, holding a bundle of freshly cut wood, and offered it without a word, placing it neatly beside the fire. Mara inclined her head, acknowledging the gesture, sensing the subtle negotiations that had begun, the unspoken exchange of respect, labor, and the possibility of trust. Around her, the soft sounds of the creek mingled with the occasional snort of a horse, the subtle crackle of the fire, and the distant rustle of the wind through sparse scrub. The landscape that had once signified total solitude now seemed to pulse with quiet life, each movement, sound, and shadow a reminder that connection, fragile, deliberate, and cautious, was beginning to weave itself into her world. The lantern flickered as she moved closer, observing the meticulous care with which the men tended their tasks, noting the patience in their eyes, the absence of force or demand. Even the quietest among them, whose presence had been the least intrusive, now appeared less like a stranger and more like an extension of the rhythm she had long established alone. Mara felt a shift within herself, subtle yet undeniable, the realization that her autonomy need not be compromised to allow another's presence, that companionship could arrive softly, through deliberate acts of labor, respect, and attention to her needs. As night deepened, the fire's warmth and the muted colors of twilight combined to create a rare sense of serenity. Mara's lips curved into a small, restrained smile, the acknowledgement of a rare, tentative balance forming between her fiercely guarded solitude and the patient, measured presence of these men. The creek gurgled gently, the fire crackled, and the cabin, once a monument to isolation, now seemed to breathe in harmony with the figures moving carefully around it, a testament to the delicate art of trust, labor, and quiet connection that had begun to define her evenings. By the time stars pricked the indigo sky, the men had settled into routines of tending the fire, checking horses, and arranging tools, their movements almost meditative, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of Mara's life, creating a fragile but promising new chapter where solitude and companionship could coexist. Night had fully claimed the Dry Creek Valley, the sky a deep indigo speckled with distant stars, the moon casting a gentle, silver light over the sparse scrub and rocky terrain. Mara moved carefully inside the cabin, lighting a lantern whose warm glow pushed back the shadows, creating an intimate pool of light against the cold night. Outside, the 6 men worked in respectful silence, repairing fences along the edge of the creek, their shadows long and wavering, stretching across the uneven ground. The quiet rhythm of their labor created a subtle harmony with the nocturnal sounds of the wilderness, the distant call of a coyote, the gentle rustle of the dry grass, and the faint murmur of the creek as it traced its way through the parched earth. Mara's hands, accustomed to years of solitude and repetitive labor, traced the edge of the lantern, feeling the comforting warmth seep through her fingers. She reflected on the unusual nature of this night. For decades, she had relied solely on herself, guarding her home and her life against the unpredictable forces of both nature and humankind. Yet here, under the moonlight, a silent accord seemed to have formed. The men's quiet diligence, their lack of unnecessary words, their careful movements, and their attentiveness to the land and her presence all spoke volumes, conveying respect without intrusion. The quiet man who had lingered near the creek now approached the cabin, his boots softly crunching against the frost-tinged soil. He paused a respectful distance away, allowing Mara to acknowledge him before stepping closer, as if understanding the boundary she had long established and never breached. Mara opened the door slightly, allowing the soft light to spill onto the porch, her expression a mixture of caution and curiosity. The other men paused their work, glancing briefly toward the cabin, then continued with a quiet resolve that seemed almost meditative. The night air carried a subtle chill, yet the presence of these men brought an unanticipated warmth to Mara's heart, a quiet reassurance that the world might be navigable in company, without compromising the hard-earned autonomy she cherished. Time seemed to stretch, the men working steadily and without complaint, the woman observing, measuring, learning to trust in small, deliberate increments. Each movement, each careful step, became a silent dialogue, a negotiation of space, respect, and shared purpose. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the fences stood solid, repaired with care and precision, and the small fire near the cabin crackled softly, its light dancing across weathered wood and dry earth. Mara allowed herself to linger at the doorway, inhaling the cool night air, feeling for the first time in years that her solitude had begun to shift. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible transformation, a recognition that companionship could exist alongside independence, that trust could grow slowly without erosion, and that the men she had permitted into her world through patience, respect, and quiet labor had become more than mere strangers. They had become tentative guardians, partners in the fragile equilibrium she had spent years cultivating alone. The first pale light of dawn crept across the dry creek valley, casting a muted glow over the small cabin and the surrounding scrubland. Frost glittered faintly on the rocky ground, catching the subtle movements of the men as they prepared their tools, adjusted saddles, and tended to their horses. Mara stood silently on the porch, cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, breath rising in soft clouds as she observed the quiet efficiency with which they moved. For decades, her mornings had been measured by necessity alone, the careful distribution of chores, the precise tending of animals, the meticulous maintenance of her cabin. Yet now, the rhythm of her solitude was subtly transformed. These men, 6 in total, had integrated seamlessly into her routines, their presence neither intrusive nor disruptive. Each step they took, each tool carefully placed or adjusted, spoke of patience, skill, and an understanding of her domain that required no verbal explanation. The quietest among them, the one who had lingered near the creek since their arrival, approached her slowly, glancing toward the creek's shallow flow, where faint ripples reflected the early light. Mara's pulse quickened subtly, not from fear, but from anticipation, the awareness that her carefully guarded world might finally accommodate another presence without the risk of compromise. She nodded slightly as he met her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the trust she was beginning to extend. The men worked in a quiet symphony of labor, hammering, measuring, adjusting, and coordinating without a single raised voice, their motions precise yet unhurried. Mara allowed herself a small step forward, hands brushing lightly against the railing of the porch, feeling the cold bite of frost but also a gentle reassurance that the land she had guarded alone for so long was still hers, even as others contributed to its care. As the sun began to rise behind distant ridges, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The men's efforts, steady and patient, seemed to breathe life into the barren landscape while Mara's gaze softened, her mind reconciling the years of solitude with the present reality of quiet companionship. The creek, once a simple source of water and survival, now echoed with the presence of shared endeavor, its soft murmur blending with the muted clatter of tools and the occasional snort of horses. For the first time in many winters, Mara allowed herself to imagine a day in which her responsibilities were shared, her solitude gently complemented by those who respected both her space and her autonomy. The frost began to melt beneath the emerging warmth of sunlight, and with it, the rigidity of her isolation began to ease. By the time the first meal was quietly prepared on a small fire outside the cabin, Mara realized that her carefully constructed world of dust, silence, and self-reliance was evolving, not diminished, but enriched by the presence of these 6 men whose patience, diligence, and respectful attention had slowly woven themselves into the fabric of her life. It was a fragile balance, delicate yet undeniable, the promise of companionship forming alongside her independence, a subtle harmony that might, at long last, endure. The sun had risen higher, washing the dry creek valley in stark, golden light that highlighted every ridge and rock, every dust plume stirred by hooves or feet. Mara stepped carefully onto the narrow path leading down to the creek, surveying the site where the men had begun constructing a modest wooden bridge to facilitate easier passage across the shallow, winding waters. For years she had navigated the creek cautiously, aware of every slippery stone and hidden dip, and the idea that a reliable crossing might now exist both intrigued and unsettled her. The men worked with quiet precision, carrying heavy planks, measuring lengths against the uneven terrain, and hammering supports firmly into the earth. Each motion seemed coordinated, almost rehearsed, yet executed with the understated humility of those who respected the land and the authority of the woman who had lived here alone for so long. Mara's hands, calloused from years of solitary labor, itched to assist, not because she lacked the strength, but because she was drawn to the rhythm of shared purpose. She adjusted angles, suggested reinforcement points, and inspected each joint, noting the care with which the men executed her directions. The quiet man, ever observant, positioned a plank with subtle grace, his eyes flicking briefly to hers to gauge approval, then returning to the task with unwavering attention. Dust rose in soft clouds around their boots, mingling with the scent of dry earth and freshly cut timber. The creek reflected the bright sunlight, tiny ripples dancing along the surface, mirroring the gentle pulse of anticipation that had begun to quicken within Mara's chest. For 2 decades, her life had been dictated solely by necessity and vigilance. Each decision, each movement, was a product of survival and solitude. Now she found herself negotiating not only the logistics of construction, but also the delicate calculus of trust. The men's quiet diligence and unassuming presence had begun to reshape her perception of company, of shared labor, and of the possibility that someone might remain by choice rather than imposition. Horses snorted and shifted their weight as Mara moved among them, issuing brief instructions or nods of acknowledgement, her authority undisputed, yet tempered by recognition of their competence. As noon approached, the bridge had taken shape, each plank secured and each support braced, a tangible testament to cooperation and the quiet melding of autonomy with companionship. Mara stepped back to inspect the completed work, noting the sturdy construction, the thoughtful placement of each beam, and the subtle harmony of effort between herself and the 6 men. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future in which her solitude might coexist with the presence of others, a delicate balance forged not through words or declarations, but through labor, respect, and the patient unfolding of mutual understanding. The creek's gentle burble, the rustling of sparse trees, and the rhythmic tapping of hammer on wood had blended into a symphony of quiet collaboration, echoing the unspoken promise that her life, long dictated by isolation, was now beginning to include threads of trust, reliability, and the possibility of enduring companionship. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly over Dry Creek, casting sharp, defined shadows across the uneven terrain, the earth dry and cracked from months without rain. Mara moved deliberately among the 6 men as they continued the laborious task of installing a long weathered wooden fence that would define the outer boundary of her property. Every plank placed and nail hammered was executed with precision, the men silent yet attentive, listening for Mara's subtle directions, reading her gestures and adjusting their motions accordingly. For years she had taken pride in her ability to manage all aspects of life alone, repairing the cabin, tending the small garden, keeping her animals safe, and defending her claim against any unwelcome presence. Now she observed the quiet synergy among the men, a rhythm that complemented her own routines without overpowering them, allowing her to recognize that cooperation could coexist with autonomy. The quietest man, who had remained observant throughout their stay, moved with particular care along the fence line, testing posts for stability before securing them. Mara noted the meticulousness of his work, the steady confidence in his hands, and the unspoken respect he showed toward both her and the land itself. The heat from the midday sun mixed with the dusty air, coating their skin with a fine layer of grit, yet the work continued unabated, fueled by a sense of shared purpose. Mara's eyes, usually sharp with the vigilance of solitude, softened slightly as she observed the transformation taking place, not in the fence itself, but in her perception of these men and their place in her life. They were not intruders, nor were they a threat. Their labor, patience, and attentiveness had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of her daily existence. Each nail driven and plank secured carried an unspoken message, the possibility of trust, the emergence of companionship, and the quiet understanding that her life, though long defined by solitude, could accommodate the presence of others without compromising the independence she held dear. As the sun began its descent toward the western ridge, casting golden light over the freshly built fence and illuminating the dust rising from their movements, Mara felt a subtle shift within herself. Her heart, long tempered by years of isolation, recognized the fragile promise of connection, the knowledge that these men, through diligence, respect, and patience, were beginning to integrate into her life in a manner that honored both her solitude and her strength. The horses nickered softly, the distant creek burbled faintly, and the men's measured movements created a symphony of quiet collaboration. Mara allowed herself to imagine a future in which her property, her routines, and her world could exist in harmony with others, a balance forged through shared labor, respect, and the gentle evolution of trust. By the time shadows stretched long across the dry creek valley, the fence stood complete, a tangible testament to the beginnings of a new chapter, one where solitude could coexist with companionship, and the rhythm of life could now include the presence of those who had entered not to claim, but to contribute. The sun sank low behind the jagged ridges of Dry Creek, bathing the valley in molten orange and crimson hues, long shadows stretching across the freshly built fence and the rough terrain that Mara had come to call home. The day's labor was complete, yet the air remained alive with the subtle hum of movement, the soft snort of horses, the occasional creak of the cabin's weathered door, and the whispered coordination of the 6 men as they cleaned tools and settled horses for the evening. Mara stood near the fence, arms crossed loosely, observing the culmination of the day's efforts with a mix of satisfaction and quiet introspection. For years, her life had been defined by the rhythm of isolation, each task undertaken alone. Each decision weighed with care, every sound and movement accounted for. Yet now, the presence of these men, working alongside her without disrupting the delicate order of her existence, represented a profound shift in the fabric of her world. The quiet man, who had remained unobtrusive yet observant since their arrival, approached the gate, his steps deliberate, carrying a plank to inspect its alignment. Mara nodded subtly, a small acknowledgement of his thoughtfulness and attention to detail. Around her, the other men adjusted the fence, their movements fluid and harmonious, each action reflecting an unspoken understanding that the land, the structures, and Mara's routines were to be respected above all. She felt an unfamiliar yet welcome warmth in her chest, a subtle recognition that the barriers she had long relied upon for protection were now complemented by human presence that did not threaten them. The horses grazed in the soft light, ears flicking attentively at every minor sound, as though sensing the transition from work to rest, from vigilance to trust. Mara allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, absorbing the panorama of Dry Creek, the glow of the sunset reflecting on the weathered wood of the cabin, the fence, and the sturdy forms of the men who had entered her life. For 2 decades, she had known only the certainty of solitude. Now she was beginning to understand the quiet power of shared effort, of deliberate companionship, and of trust earned through patience, respect, and labor. As the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon, painting the sky with shades of violet and deep indigo, Mara's heart accepted a new rhythm, one where her life's carefully guarded spaces could coexist with the presence of those who chose to remain, who moved gently within her world without altering the essence of her solitude. That evening, the creek's soft murmur, the low rustle of the scrub, and the settled breathing of horses became the soundtrack to a life no longer entirely solitary, a delicate and enduring harmony forged through quiet diligence, trust, and the tentative bloom of connection. Night had fully descended upon Dry Creek, cloaking the valley in a deep indigo veil punctuated by distant twinkling stars. Mara stood on the cabin's porch, lantern casting a warm, flickering glow over the weathered wood, her silhouette sharp against the soft luminescence. The 6 men gathered near a modest fire, the orange glow reflecting off their faces and glinting faintly from the metal of their tools and saddles. Horses shifted gently at the edge of the clearing, steam rising from their flanks in the cool night air. For 20 winters, Mara had known the precise contours of solitude, every sound, every movement, every shadow meticulously catalogued and assessed. But tonight, the stillness of the evening was different. The rhythmic crackle of the fire, the faint murmur of voices as the men discussed their day's work in low tones, and the occasional snort or shuffle of the horses blended into a gentle symphony that neither disturbed nor threatened her, yet altered the texture of her existence. In subtle, profound ways, Mara traced the outline of the cabin with her gaze, noting how the men had integrated seamlessly into her life over the preceding days, each task executed with care and patience. She felt an unfamiliar sense of completeness, not because her solitude was gone, but because it had been quietly complemented by the presence of others who respected it. The quiet man, who had remained the most observant throughout their stay, approached the fire, offering a piece of freshly gathered kindling. Before stepping back with a deferential nod, Mara allowed a faint smile, her first real acknowledgement of the fragile trust that had developed between her and these 6 strangers who had, through respect, patience, and diligence, become partners in maintaining her world rather than intruders into it. The night air carried the scent of wood smoke, mingled with the faint aroma of the creek and dry earth, creating a sensory tapestry that anchored Mara in the present moment. Around the fire, the men moved with fluid ease, adjusting logs, checking equipment, and speaking only when necessary, their quiet presence reinforcing the delicate balance Mara had begun to accept. She realized, as she looked out over the creek, glinting softly in the starlight, that life need not be entirely solitary to be her own. Connection could exist alongside independence, forged gently through shared labor, mutual respect, and patience. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, now pulsed with life in a new harmonious rhythm. Mara inhaled the crisp night air, lantern held steady, heart unburdened, knowing that for the first time in many years, her world had expanded without compromise. The 6 men, the horses, the creek, and the soft glow of firelight formed an unspoken covenant, a testament to resilience, trust, and the quiet, enduring possibility of companionship. Under the canopy of stars, Mara's life had entered a chapter where dust and silence were no longer synonymous with loneliness, but with measured harmony, patience, and the understated joy of shared existence that respected the autonomy she had fiercely preserved for decades.